Yes, hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, depending on where you're joining from. We're excited today to have the opportunity to have this interaction with all of you. Let me rename myself so that it will be possible to know who I am. Yes, so my name is Paul Frimpong. I'm the Executive Director from the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, ACCPA, the organizer of today's meeting or program called the FOCAC Dialogue, which is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Dialogue. So today we are pretty much excited, and we know there's going to be a very fruitful engagement, insightful engagement, as we have impressive lineup of speakers that are experienced, have their own experience, their own field, cutting across international relations, economics, and investment, and all of that, as well as academia, will be sharing with us their insight and perspectives when it comes to Africa's engagement with China. With a bit of background, of course, to the ACCPA, I just wanted to give benefit of the doubt of those that are joining us for the first time. So I just want to give a brief introduction about the ACCPA. And then, of course, I'll give a brief intro about today's platform and why we have created it, and why it's exciting for us to get a chance to host you. So the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory is a full-fledged think tank focusing on Africa-China relations, as our name depicts. We are headquartered in Accra, Ghana, but we have teams in other multiple countries, such as in Tanzania, in the DRC, in Botswana, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Ethiopia, and of course, you have teams in UK and China as well. So what we are trying to do is basically to create a platform that gives the African voice or share perspective on our continuous engagement with China. As we all know, China has been Africa's #1 trading partner for over a decade and counting. So we believe that it's about time that we have platform for Africans to share our perspective, what we think about engagement with China, because it is about the sort of engagement our respective governments are having with China that we are talking about. So it concerns us as people of Africa. So that is who we are. Of course, we are a think tank. We do in all full scale of think tank works, including writing articles, papers, policy briefs, and of course, organizing platforms for engagement, because we know the dissemination of the work that we do can be done through many ways. And one of them is through such platforms as today, whether we're doing it virtually or we're doing it physically in person for engagement. So we are truly excited to have the opportunity again to welcome all of you. In the past, we've organized such platforms. If you follow us for a while now, we have a series of flagship programs that we do. Most of them we've held in the past, and they're all available on our YouTube channel. So if you register to join us from our website, you can also as well check our social medias, LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, on the X, and of course, YouTube, where you can get some of our previous engagement. For today's, fortunately for us, we have some of our panelists here that have already engaged in the past, that is shared a different perspective. You can find all of these recordings on our platform on YouTube, especially, so that you can get a recap of some of the discussion that we've had. I'm sure you're joining this platform because you were keenly interested in what is actually happening between Africa and China. And we are very excited that through the ACCPA, we are able to do this work, and we are hoping to do more. As a policy research and think tank, we are open for collaboration, looking for partners in all spheres, whether in economic or industry or business-wise. So if you're on this platform and your institutions, organization you work with, you believe their interests align with the work that we are doing, and you want to be a partner to us, we are more than happy to engage you further and see where we can collaborate to promote Africa development agenda as we continue to engage with China. Thank you very much for that audience. Now today, of course, we are here to engage in what we call FOCAC Dialogue, which is a Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. As we all know, in the background of FOCAC, which started in the year 2000 and has been held every 3 years, I'm sure our speakers will give more insight into that, so I wouldn't want to go there. We believe that it has become one of the single most important multi-country level engagement in the world, especially in the context of Africa, that we all know has given a lot back to the continent, and we still have a long way to go. So therefore, we find this platform very important. And as it will have it, today in Beijing, currently in Beijing now, participating in other important engagement here. Today, as we're also hosting our FOCAC in Beijing here, the Chinese government has announced that on September 4th to 6th is when the FOCAC for this year is happening. So in a couple of weeks' time or in the next 2 months, there's going to be Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the 9th edition here, in marking the 24 years since the establishment of FOCAC. So it's going to happen between 4th and 6th September here in Beijing, as was announced today. So we are very privileged that on the day of announcement of this FOCAC summit in Beijing, we are also here having our side of the FOCAC summit. We hope that after FOCAC, as is going to happen in September 4 to 6, we will gather here to have a post-FOCAC dialogue. We are hoping to work with some of our partners to also interrogate the aftermath of the FOCAC dialogue. We believe that's also very crucial. But for today, we have a different assignment. We are looking into the FOCAC in general and history, and of course, heading into the next FOCAC, which is happening between 4th and 6th September, what actually is happening and what could happen and what should happen. So we are very privileged and excited to have all of you join us, and of course, our speakers to join us to share their perspective. Now, the session for this first session is structured in two. So we're going to have a keynote address by a renowned professional. I will introduce him briefly. And then we're going to have a panel session with two other distinguished speakers and a moderator that will take us through that session. And then later in the afternoon, which is going to be around 8:30 p.m. in Beijing time, and depending on where you are, 2:30 p.m. Central European time. And then it's going to be 12:30 p.m. in the Ghana time. We're going to have our second panel session, which also have an impressive list of speakers that will share their perspective on different topics. Now, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who's going to be the keynote address for the next 20-25 minutes. We have Professor David Monyai. He's the director for Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Professor is a renowned international relations and diplomacy professor. He's with a PhD in international relations from the University of Witwatersrand. He previously served as a section manager, international relations policy analysis at the South African Parliament, providing strategic management, parliamentary, foreign policy formulation, and monitoring and analysis. In fact, he has published a lot. In fact, I have one of his books. I met him here in Beijing, and of course, he was gracious enough to hand me one of his recent books on regional integration. Very, very impressive book. And he has worked, in the space of Africa-China relations for decades, way before some of us even decided to enter the space. So today we are very privileged to have Professor David Monyai from the Center for Africa-China Studies of University of Johannesburg joining us to give us a 20 minutes keynote. So Prof, please, we welcome you to deliver your keynote. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon from South Africa. Johannesburg, very cold. It is indeed a great pleasure. Let me start by thanking you and your center for wonderful work that you have done. And I really wish this deliberation a success. The talk is on the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The 9th Forum Summit will take place in Beijing, as you have already mentioned, on the 4th, from the 4th to the 6th of September, under the theme, Joining Hands to Advance Modernization and Build a High-Level China-Africa Community with a Shared Future. This is quite an important theme to really look into that. Over the last 24 years, the forum has become the premier mechanism for coordinating China-Africa relations. It is a platform for Chinese and African leaders to deliberate on common interests and forge a common agenda in steering the relationship. The forum is a comprehensive management that encompasses almost everything from security and defense to trade, investment, finance, social development, technology, among many things. Although both Africa and China have changed in significant ways since the inaugural summit in 2000, China is on its path to the second centenary goal of building a modern socialist country, while Africa is trying to restructure its economy through the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I think what we see are changes that are taking place in China itself, as well as on the African continent. Nonetheless, the two sides still share strategic capabilities and complementarities which create enough scope for cooperation. This presentation will look at the areas African leaders can focus on when they meet the Chinese leaders in September. About 21 countries are either going through debt distress or face a high risk on debt distress, which translates into 455 million African citizens living in debt-trapped countries. Since 2010, Africa's debt has increased by 183% to over US 1.8 trillion. Some of the countries like Ethiopia, Zambia, Ghana, and Djibouti had defaulted on their debt servicing. It is important to flag this at a time in which at a global level, Western countries tend to use this as a way of flagging and blaming China on the so-called debt trap. I think the main aim is to put this and really get deeper into some of the challenges that Africans are confronting with or without China assistance and massive infrastructure built on the African continent. And the countries that I've mentioned are holding about 13% of Africa external debt. And as I've already mentioned, China is but among many countries that the continent owes debt to. And the classical example of Zambia, I think it has come to light that with all the smearing of China on the so-called debt trap, it has come out that China is not the biggest challenge to Zambia's debt. China was more than willing to restructure the Zambian debt question. However, it is Western private lenders that stood on the way, and Zambia still faces a huge challenge from this issue. Hence, African countries must raise the debt issue in an even level-headed way without getting into the geopolitics of debt that we have seen in recent years. Africa still faces a huge infrastructure finance deficit, over 100 billion. The continent needs infrastructure like roads, rail, and ports, especially in the context of the free trade area agreement that has been signed. China has expressed its interests in continuing with the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, a Chinese-sponsored global infrastructure program from which African countries have benefited immensely. African leaders must negotiate infrastructure deals with China, focusing on infrastructure that enhances regional integration. It is quite important for us to constantly look at the kind of infrastructure. I think priority must be given to infrastructure that does not speak to only one country, but infrastructure that speak across countries within the regions, economic regions of the continent. Trade is an important part of China-African relation. Over the last 15 years, China has been Africa's biggest trading partner. And for South Africa, for the last 15 years, China has been #1. And it's going to be #1 trading partner for foreseeable future. And it's not only South Africa, for the region, SADC, and across the African continent. Last year, trade between the two sides reached $282 billion US. I think if we go back to the year 2000, this was a small figure. And therefore, I think we've seen a massive volumes of trade between the continent and China. And this tells us that China remains the most important partner, a strategic partner, reliable partner. And not only are we as Africans trading with China, the trade volumes that are increasing are also attracting other players, whether be it in Europe, United States, Latin America, and other Asian countries. And we have seen more and more countries looking at Africa as an attractive place to do trade, investments, infrastructure development, and a number of other key issues. However, there's still room for improvement when we look at that. And Africa still exports largely primary commodities that do not generate sufficient earnings. And this is a major issue we face as Africans, that we continue to export raw material. And so whether it's trade with China or Europe or other partners, I think Africa needs to pause and work hard, particularly in the area of beneficiations. There is a need to improve the goods that we sell into Chinese market, a sophisticated market, a market that is more than 400 million middle class. And I think we need to realize that it cannot be business as usual. And that is a task that Africans themselves need to look into. There are still barriers such as customs and other regulations that slow down. They need to look into those issues, how best to clear those trade barriers, particularly in Africa as well as in China. Trade finance is also another issue that African firms are struggling with. These and other issues must be discussed at the forum. So as we go forward, there are other areas that we need to look into as we talk about China-Africa relation. We need to look at the new issues that are coming into issues of relation among states, particularly the issue of technology. How best can Africa take advantage of changes that are taking place on the world stage? It is critical, therefore, for Africa to ensure that the recent concluded third plenary of the CPC looked into resolve to make new technologies such as AI, advanced material, biotech, and green energy, the drivers of its economy. China is already leading in the production of solar panels, the PV batteries, and electronic vehicles. I think on our roads across the African continent, particularly in South Africa, Chinese cars have entered the market. And I think we're expecting more to come. And it is important for leaders to look into arrival of these issues. In light of tensions with Europe, United States, Africa has no issue with China and its new technology. This is an advancement that the African continent is looking forward. I think African leaders ought to, should and must ensure that as China brings in new vehicles, build of solar panels, batteries, with our continent being a strategic continent with rich strategic mineral resources, the continent needs to ensure that it takes advantage of changes and advancements that China is making in this field. For instance, the vehicles, I think the bigger question is that vehicles ought to be assembled on the African continent. Issues such as leather, there are a number of items that enter into a vehicle. Tires, iron, steel. We need to ensure that African materials are used and enhance and ensure that the African continent benefits maximum from this cooperation. And this should not just come as a way of demanding. It's just a question of hard work among our leaders, hard work at a regional level, coordination, upskilling in terms of knowledge, and ensure that we have special hubs in different regions and avoid a situation in which each and every African country establish similar issues. I think there is a need for differentiation, particular countries working with a number of issues. Why the African continent is important, not just to China, but to the world. I think we need to understand that we are 1.4 billion people on the African continent. This is a huge market, but that market requires education, skills, requires infrastructure that we've already spoken about. There is a need of organizing and move into the new era as we enter the fourth industrial revolution. And therefore, I think the task before African leaders, African people, scholars like us, is to ensure that we work hard to realize the Agenda 2063 and engage China as our strategic partner in a win-win, but the whole work has to be done by us. It's easy to just complain about issues, but we have to look into core issues, anti-corruption, building regulatory framework that ensures increased trade among ourselves firstly, and enter into agreement with strategic partners as China. And therefore, from the 4th to the 6th of September, there is so much that needs to be raised as we see the relationship between Africa and China enter a new phase, a new solidarity that is required. I think we have passed that phase that we're talking about, liberation struggle. We really need to get into pragmatic and serious about the business of alleviating poverty on the African continent, learn from China, and have agreements that ensure maximum benefit for Chinese as well as for Africans. Chair, on that note, I thank you and I wish this seminar a success. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor David Munyai, for that very insightful delivery. Indeed, it is important for Africa to reflect on how the West seems to blame China for bringing a lot of debt to Africa. And also when it comes to infrastructure deals, Africa needs to look for areas of regional integration when it comes to deals that are with China, not set to focus just on one country, ways by which we can leverage every platform with China to build a united Africa for sustainable development, aligning with our Agenda 2063. And also, as he said, indeed, we have to look into issues, particularly technology, and look out for ways we can keep ourselves abreast when it comes to the issues of technology. Indeed, we are in a technological era, and technology is evolving, with China being one of the top people. So as Africans, we need to leverage every platform in Africa to also keep ourselves abreast when it comes to technology. Also, there is this a wake-up call for African stakeholders to work hard with China to look out for ways by which we can work strategically with China to get into our Agenda 2063. All right, Professor David Monyai, we are so grateful for such insights shared, and we thank you so much for setting the pace for our webinar today. Okay, so I'm Teddy Mercy, a research associate at the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, and I'm set to moderate the first panel discussion. So without much ado, I would like for us to proceed into our first panel discussion. And once again, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar on behalf of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Oh, here I can see our panelists are all ready. So today our first panel discussion is set to discuss and give us insights into the evolution of FOCAC, the key milestones, major agreements, and shifts in focus areas across the years. So since the inception of FOCAC, it has really been a great platform for African countries and Chinese heads to gather every 3 years to deliberate on issues of mutual benefit. As this year is also set to have the 9th FOCAC Dialogue, as Mr. Frimpong and Professor David said, happening on the 2nd, 4th of September. So we are here with our panel discussion to set the pace as a precursor for this year's FOCAC. So we want to learn about the evolution of FOCAC, how it has shifted its focus in the past years, and what is expected to unfold in the coming years when it comes to Africa-China relations under the framework of FOCAC. All right, so before we begin our panel discussion, please permit me to read out the profile of our distinguished panelists for today. Okay, so our first panelist is in the person of Dr. Stacey Lenks, who happens to be a South African national and assistant professor at Leiden University, the Netherlands, where she teaches China-African relations in a changing global order at the graduate level. She also holds the position of Africa-Asia Coordinator at the International Institute of Asian Studies. Lenks has worked in the China-African space for over a decade and continues to focus her research on foreign policy, geopolitics, and African agency bearing. Specifically, Lenks has focused on an array of areas spanning human rights, African agency, critical minerals, as well as responsible value chains in Africa-China engagement. So, all right, Dr. Stacey, you are welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much, Mercy, and I'd like to thank Paul as well for inviting me to this very special webinar. I think it's fantastic that it coincides on the day that we have found out when the dates will be for the FOCAC this year. And it just so happens to also coincide with my birthday. So it's going to be a very special one. It's going to be a special FOCAC, 24th edition. Thank you for the introduction again, Mercy. And perhaps I will start by just reiterating that my role in the China-Africa space has been predominantly focused on the interface of academic research and policy. So while I find myself at the university and teach a course on China-Africa relations in a global changing order, I also work with many policymakers, specifically here in Europe and in the Netherlands, in particular where I'm based, to give them insights and to keep them kind of up to date about what is happening when it comes to China-Africa relations. And as mentioned, I've been in the China-Africa space for over a decade, and that gives me a good vantage point to also have some experience and some insights with regards to the evolution of FOCAC itself. I want to refrain from giving everyone a history lesson, as it were, on FOCAC. So what I want to do today is just highlight some points that I find significant in terms of how FOCAC has been received in the international order, and how we have seen various changes in terms of the role of FOCAC globally speaking. So while it's important that we want to look towards the future of FOCAC and the future of China-Africa relations, of course, we have to begin with a bit of a history or a bit of a look back in terms of how far we've come with this multilateral constellation. If we look at the evolution of FOCAC, we see that over time, the agendas have changed. FOCAC has not been this kind of stagnant or static multilateral grouping that many people might have thought it was initially. When it came onto the scene in 2000, I don't think there was much speculation around it. I think it flew under the radar quite significantly. But what we saw is that in 2006, when we had the first big sums of money being pledged, and the establishment of the China-Africa Fund for Development, we noticed that international onlookers all of a sudden became quite interested in what was happening. So after 2006, I would say that FOCAC in particular really sparked international interest in what was happening in China-Africa relations. So the forum in itself has really been a marker of drawing eyes towards China-Africa relations, even though these relations have existed for decades prior to the establishment of FOCAC itself. It really drew in the attention of onlookers. And what we know is that initially, the forum was met with quite significant speculation, particularly from third-party observers. There was a lot of speculation around where this would head to, what China's intentions were, how Africa was potentially or not being naive or co-opted into relations with China. And we see this in the response, for example, of third parties and traditionally Western parties and Western nations. After 2006, in 2008, both the European Parliament as well as the United States state both issued, for example, foreign policy kind of resolutions. So in 2008, the European Parliament resolution on China's policy and its effects on Africa, for example, was released. That same year, we have the US Department of State releasing documents on China in Africa and the implications for US foreign policy. So as we see, then already large speculation was kind of engendered through FOCAC, which signified how important this forum actually was. Unfortunately, at this time, though us as researchers were already doing work on China-Africa relations, there was very little knowledge or international knowledge about what was actually happening. So again, this was a period of speculation and a lot of inaccuracies about what was actually happening in China-Africa relations. What we see after that is that there has been time for research to develop in terms of informing our understanding of the nuances around China-Africa relations. Now, unfortunately for onlookers, policy has taken quite a long time to catch up with the information that we've gathered through research. So what you see is continued policy even after 2008 and long into, I would say, even 2020, of a lot of factual inaccuracies of what FOCAC is about, and the dynamics of China-Africa relations. What we do see, however, is that slowly, and especially in my work, what we see is that there seems to be more of an appetite for trying to understand what is actually happening in China-Africa relations, particularly from foreign onlookers. And I think that this has to do with the realization that FOCAC is here to stay. So in earlier FOCACs, what we saw after a lot of speculation was a lot of discourse and rhetoric around the fact that China-Africa relations were somehow unstable, or that you know, they had peaked and that there would then be a drop-off point, for example. But what we've seen is that FOCAC has remained quite steadfast and is not going anywhere, and has actually grown from strength to strength with each summit. And what this has in turn sparked is a realization for policymakers outside of China, Africa, to recognize that FOCAC is here to stay, and that their policies in turn actually need to take into consideration the realities of this relationship and of the changing dynamics. So what started out as a lot of misinformation around China-Africa relations, I do think now is slowly changing because of the research that has been done. The reality is that China-Africa relations will always be politicized. There will always be other agendas that drive policymaking around China-Africa relations. But for third-party onlookers, what we are realizing on the ground or in policy circles is that the realization that FOCAC is here to stay means that policy, for example, here in Europe, also needs to adjust to these realities, and particularly the realities that have been brought out through our research as academics, through think tank work, that has been very instrumental in highlighting the nuances of this relationship. So what we do see are slight, if not major, policy shifts, or at least in the rhetoric or the discourses around China-Africa relations. Even so much as earlier this week, I was reading a piece by an American think tank, and I was quite surprised in regards to the dynamics and the facts of China-Africa relations. Maybe as a final point that I would like to make is that research really needs to remain a cornerstone for informing our policy around China-Africa relations. As we've seen since the onset of FOCAC, research has informed positively, I would say, policies around China-Africa engagements. And so the place for research really cannot be underestimated in terms of these relations going forward, both in terms of what is put out for external third-party actors, but also within China-Africa relations themselves. These relations are not stagnant. They are changing, as we see with the different agendas that have changed throughout the time since FOCAC's inception, with the inclusion of, for example, green and sustainable topics and agendas, as well as localization, regionalization, local manufacturing, supply chains, value chains of certain goods, particularly when it comes to critical minerals and electronic vehicles or battery manufacturing, for example. These have changed with the times. And so it's important that we as researchers keep up with this and remain very connected to policy and inform policy in a way that's constructive to continue on China-Africa engagement for the positive. I'll stop at that for now. I have much more to say, but I welcome questions along the way. And once again, thank you for giving me a platform today.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Stacy. That was a very great introduction with much insight shared. Indeed, FOCAC has come to stay and is not going anywhere. So, okay, please, our distinguished attendees, the session has already begun, so please, we are expecting to have a very interactive section, so don't hesitate to send me your questions using the Q&A button, and it's going to be addressed in due time, actually. So, all right, so our second panelist is also ready, and it's in the person of Professor Zhu. But before I hand over to him, please permit me to read his profile. Okay, so our second panelist is Professor Zhu Yaxiong. Please permit me if I didn't get the name right, who is an associate professor at the College of Economics and Management at the Xinjiang Normal University and China Africa International Business School, multidisciplinary expert, legal translator, and courtroom interpreter. He is an anti-money laundering specialist, regularly lectures on the topics of Chinese economy and culture, industrial cluster in China, and Chinese development and China-Africa cooperation for the Office of China Aid at Xinjiang Normal University. He has been a consultant for many companies and government agencies and one vice director of the EU Municipal Bureau of Commerce. Zhu is excellent in the field of cross-cultural communication, international business law, international economics and trade, and China and Africa Economic and Trade Cooperation. Okay, so before I hand over to him, please do also send in your questions using the Q&A button so that it will be addressed by our panelists, and we are hoping to have a very interactive section here. All right, so Professor Zhu, please, you can give us your introductory remarks on the topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mercy. So I'm very honored to have this opportunity of sharing my understanding of FOCAC. Actually, as you can hear from, about my introduction, although I have been in constant interacting with my international students and sometimes international friends in terms of like China-Africa relationship, or particularly trade and economic relationship, but I haven't focused very seriously on the detailed development of our bilateral relationship between African countries and China. And as you can see, so my understanding of this FOCAC and its impact on both sides starts from my own observation of my last years of experience. So thinking of the evolution of a FOCAC, you see, at the earliest in 2000, we see the first FOCAC and took place, and actually at that time, China was still trying really hard to enter the WTO and to join in the global family of economics. So you realize at that time, actually, from my perspective, it's like China or Chinese government at that time was trying really hard to to make more friends, as we understand, more friends can make your journey easier. So we are preparing to make more friends. So maybe in the future, we can have more corporations. However, I think at that time, China was more focus was on our domestic development, preparing for the for what may happen to us after China entered the WTO, because although after over 20 years of reform and opening up, China had successfully transformed from a domestic market from a seller's market to a buyer's market. That means within the country, we see a lot of competition between companies, and our people are able to choose from among different brands, a lot of products by our own product producers, and also we see a lot of international brands in our domestic market. You realize at that time, and also at that time, China's trade path was mostly westward and to US and the European countries. Those are our bigger markets. And such can also be supported by the trade figures or trade volumes between China and African countries. So in that case, I realized within domestic discussions among the people, yes, Africans countries, they used to be a friend, lots of friends that we hear from about you see, and for pretty long, early already started a relationship and friendship with African countries. If we go back further, it would be like over 100 years ago, we had the contact with African countries in African culture. But in recent history, you see China had been trying really hard to gain our own independence politically and economically as well, and also try to be accepted by the global community. So you see China resumed literally, China has been pretty isolated by the Western country or the bigger market in the world. Then we started our reform opening up West. We're trying really hard to solve our own problem by creating more jobs for our people, increasing our own people's income, and trying hard to resume the membership of GATT, then tried really hard to become a member of WTO. You realize in the whole process of, from my perspective, China had been trying really hard to solve our own problems. Then after 2001, China is fully entering into WTO. We see a lot of opportunities of developing economic and trade relationship with the whole world market. So we see the fast economic growth, but still we have setbacks of in increasing our competitiveness of our products, and then also when our market has been kind of negative influenced based because of subprime mortgage crisis, and then the financial crisis after that. You see China's exportation experienced a lot of hardship. So then possibly a lot more attention has been attracted to China-African relationship. You'll see current growth in terms of the forming of in our university, the China Institute of African Studies, which started in 2007. At that time, I just I got my PhD from Fudan University. So you see, since then you see a lot more research have been carried out in the university as well as outside other university and research institutes, and also you see more and more economic corporations like a Chamber of Commerce, and they are trying hard to provide platforms and create opportunities for the business people to on both sides to meet with each other. And also you see the development of the EU market, because EU, EU is a country level city under Jinhua's jurisdiction, and Jinhua is a city in the middle of Zhejiang province. So this province is very famous for its entrepreneurship and SMEs. And you see the developing EU market gradually, I think in the late 1970s, gained a lot of international recognition. You see first some purchasers from Western countries came to buy from EU market. Then we see African buyers are here, and we see the difficulty of exporting to developing countries because of the old way of trade regulatory mechanisms. And of course, from here, we also realize that we need to reform the mechanisms of international trade regulation or regulatory mechanism. So, and of course, by so doing, we see even locally and from our EU market, we see increase in trade happening between EU and African countries. And also in our university, we started from 2011, we started to have international MBA program, which attracts a lot of students from African countries. Some of them, I'm pretty sure, chose this university because it's proximity to the largest small commodities wholesale market, because it's very convenient for them to procure products for their own country people. And lots of our graduates from this program actually started their business in EU market. And you see, and from here you also realize the increasing attention have been paid to this China and African trade and economic relationship. And then in recent years, you see the FOCAC declarations, or we see expanded cooperation appear. That also helps understand China's growth in itself. You see, at the beginning, try hard to survive, to make our own company able to compete with the Western companies, and then to start to accumulate our own technology in order to better develop ourselves. Then we also face a lot of international competition, like in face of in the Western discourse of sustainable development. However, you see after 2010, China started our green development agenda. You realize that if we look into the real content of this development, lots of goals under the sustainable development have actually under our reform and opening up agendas. So, and the difference between the green development and the sustainable development is that by a green development, we're trying to let people know the importance of our environmental protection, or so ecological diversity. So with and all cut our carbon emission, etc. All these are actually in consistency with the international consensus concerning sustainable development. However, what we do is we're trying hard to let people know whenever you decide you are designing your development projects, you have to take into consideration the environmental protection and ecological protection. By so doing, you also realize China has successfully accumulated adequate technological advantage in such areas like solar panels and windmills, and also, for example, water power stations, and nearly all these areas are related to the basic demand for the people in terms of sustainable development has in all these areas actually is also in line with our understanding of people-centered development, you realize that when such a basic service in terms of electricity provision and road network, high-speed railway network, and also communication system network has been installed, we are able to integrate our own domestic market while at the same time providing the people in the mountainous areas and western areas access to the development of in the east and coastal areas, which are actually the most developed areas in China. So after we've been developed for so many decades and gained some achievements, we are more sure about our competence to offer much more help to African countries in terms of green development and also creating jobs for the local people. Although this actually has been proven recently by my in my trip to EU Bureau of Commerce in terms of how taking I was at that time I was taking some friends from Ethiopia, led by a professor from Addis Ababa University to learn about e-commerce development. So my former colleague in the Bureau of Commerce, they just provide us information concerning like the composition of goods of goods traded with African countries has actually changed from the past, the manufactured goods to some now more have been about like a material or intermediate goods that can be processed in African countries and to be sold to the African people. So in that case, I realized that our trade and economic cooperation has been strengthened, and we also see that the improved composition of our trade structure has actually led to industrialization in African countries, which we are pretty sure are able to create jobs for the local people and to help them earn their income. And you also see with particularly after 2010, the Belt and Road Initiative was proposed. A lot more infrastructure has been provided to African countries and African people. People are now more able to enjoy like a communication, modern communication, so that which also lead to in the future development of digital economy, which I'm sure can provide African people with a platform to participate the future development. You'll see, in certain sense, with the basic infrastructure of like a computer communication, computer. Although maybe many countries in Africa do not have very comprehensive industrial system, but their people can participate the software programming so that they are more able to participate the digital economic development in the future. In that case, I guess African people will gain more access to future development. Okay, I think I'd like to take the questions from our audience and from my colleagues. So that'll be all from me.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhu. I think from your submission, there is indeed a lot to be learned from China's own development. As African countries, we need to leverage on our relationship with China for our own development, right from infrastructure, trade, to green development and sustainable development as well. So I'd like us to continue with the section, and I'll start with the first round of questions. So please do send in your questions so that will be addressed by our panelists as well. So Dr. Stacy, I would like to start with you. And the question is, how do you think the latest agreement and initiatives under FOCAC are addressing the evolving needs and priorities of African countries? Thank you.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question, Mercy?
Okay, so I was like, how do you think the evolving needs and the latest agreements under FOCAC are helping to address the needs and priorities of African countries?
I think that so if we look at FOCAC and we look, for example, at as I had mentioned, if we look at the FOCAC, the latest FOCAC's focus, let's say, on green development and green investments, those are very key areas that we didn't really see much attention paid to in previous FOCACs, for example. And as I had mentioned, I think with each round of FOCAC, there's definitely a malleability, right, and a dynamism, an adaptation of the agenda that is set. And if we look at the different agendas across a period of time or across the various FOCACs, and we see the needs of Africa also not so much changing, but evolving, right? As the relationship evolves, what we see happening is we see that there are certain gaps that are identified, or risks that are maybe identified or that come to the fore as time continues or over a period of time. And so you have more attention being paid to some of these risks. And on the one hand, you see it as a risk, but also an opportunity is this focus on green development, right? That's an opportunity for an African green agenda that is not just focused on particular climate goals, for example, but also very much focused on energy security on the continent. So energy security remains a huge challenge within the continent, and how to secure our energy needs while at the same time tackling issues around climate change and sustainable energy sources is an area that's gained increased focus, particularly through a forum like FOCAC, right? And FOCAC is obviously not the only mechanism. There are other mechanisms surrounding FOCAC that allow for this kind of exchange. But I think FOCAC sets the tone to a certain degree of placing certain issues on the agenda and high on the agenda. And so I'm interested, and I'm looking very much forward to this new agenda, let's say, or topic of modernization and what this is going to look like in terms of our discussions in September. Modernization is something, of course, that the continent, I think, desires and needs, but how we balance that forward movement of modernization, industrialization, with also preserving local knowledges, right? Local ways of doing things is going to be extremely important at the end of the day, right? So again, kind of reflecting on the saying that we all know, African solutions to African problems, that is still something that needs to feature within any kind of agenda, even if it is with cooperation with the likes of China, for example. Maybe something I saw here on the question and answer box, and it's a question about, is Africa really in partnership with China, or is Africa just a growing market for Chinese goods and services? What I wanted to just say about that is, this idea that Africa is just a market, I think in itself is a bit problematic. Being a market places you in quite a strong position. So I wouldn't use the terminology just a market. I think that's quite significant. And at the end of the day, a lot of these goods and services are needed for Africa's development, right? And can be catalysts for development on the continent. So when we speak of goods and services, we have to realize that this is a huge basket that we're speaking of. We're not just speaking of goods and services as, you know, just what usually comes to mind is let's say affordable or cheap Chinese goods infiltrating the African market. It's much more than that. It's goods and services also include goods in the form of infrastructure developments, or like my colleague was saying, like the resources necessary for infrastructure development, for example, or green technologies. For example, if we do look at sustainable developments and green technologies, currently Africa does need solar panels, which are majority supplied by China. That doesn't mean that it needs to remain that way for time immemorial or for, you know, indefinitely, but it is a starting block for our own development within that space, right? So I think we have to be a bit nuanced about how we see that. And the same goes for seeing Africa as being fragmented and weak. Of course, to a certain degree, the continent is, relatively speaking, to China, but what we know through a lot of research and experience is that Africa does have much more of a say and a negotiating power and agency within China-Africa relations than what we often assume. And I think something like China literacy on the continent is very important in order to take these relations even further and to optimize them for African development. So I will stop there.
All right, Dr. Stacy, thank you so much. So, Professor Zhu, can you please help us understand how these evolutions have impacted the Africa-China partnership, how the evolutions under FOCAC has impacted the Africa-China relations?
I'd come to this question of like this African really in partnership with China, or Africa is just a growing market for Chinese goods and services. I guess if we are looking to the opportunity of it helping us enjoy the products of internationally, good products internationally, so African people can both buy from European countries and American countries and also China. So it depends on how you are able to afford them, or how you balance the price and the quality and availability to the people. So you realize, so in that case, yeah, we agree. China has been a very large trade partner with many countries, but because of China's like a productivity and for some time China was known for its like cheap labor, and such a cheap and disciplined labor and well-educated labor. And then the second, if we come to the African position in negotiating with China, I think it's natural. You realize that China is not dominating the position while we're cooperating with African countries. African countries actually priorly, you realize that have the European countries and American countries, USA, for example, are providing a lot of products and service, and a lot, and also buying a lot from African countries. Now you have got an alternative. You can choose to buy. In that case, actually, China and other Western countries are competing with each other in selling to African markets. So in that case, you have choices. Okay.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, Professor Zhu. I think we have a lot of questions here in the Q&A section, and I'd like us to address it. So, okay, so Rebecca is asking, what are the measures that African countries can take to ensure mutual benefit in Africa-China trade relations? I think any of you can take that. What are the measures that African countries can take to ensure mutual benefit in Africa-China trade relations? Okay, so Dr. Stacey, can you please help us to address the question?
Yes, maybe just as an initial comment, I think trade relations is probably one of the areas that has, I wouldn't say been the most controversial, but has probably been a gap in China-Africa relations for a very long time. And it was kind of arguably a blind spot for a very long time in terms of the trade deficit between China and Africa. And it's a challenge in terms of obviously the developmental levels of if we take Africa as a continent together with China are obviously quite vast and quite different. That being said, over time, trade relations have improved, and what we see is that there's a lot more export happening from Africa to China, and a lot more measures being taken in terms of preferential, or not per se preferential, but allowing more goods from Africa to enter into the Chinese market. So there have been significant improvements. That's not to say that that there's not more room for improvements. And I think that that's an area of focus that African policymakers and Chinese policymakers are really going to focus on. And I think that will actually be quite a significant topic in the upcoming FOCAC. So there's a lot of room for improvements in terms of that. Measures that African countries themselves can take, I think that is a challenge, and it's always going to have to be measures that are come to with dialogue and consensus, both between African policymakers and Chinese policymakers. So I don't think it's something that alone rests on African countries to be able to ensure mutual benefits, for example. And again, just to reiterate, I think that the development of our industries within the African continent is the first kind of step, or one of the biggest steps, to ensure most mutual benefits, let's say, when it comes to trade between China and Africa.
Okay. Okay, I think that is well understood. And we have another question here for Anna Godfred, who is a finalist at St. Augustine University. So he wants to know, what are the potential benefits and challenges of China's involvement in large-scale infrastructure projects across Africa? So he's asking here, what do you think are the potential benefits and challenges of China's involvement in large-scale infrastructure projects across Africa? Okay. Professor Zhu, would you like to take that?
I'd like to comment a little bit on the sorry, yeah, the previous one, it's lost. China has already exempted the tariff on, I guess, 98% of imported goods from some African countries. I think possibly nowadays over 20 such African countries enjoy this favorable condition when they're exporting to Chinese market. And the other thing is when in my interaction with a lot of entrepreneurs in my place and in China, I realize lots of them are actually thinking about relocating their production to places closer to the market, like African countries. However, very often a question will be asked is it safe to invest and live there? So this actually is a big concern to a lot of potential investors to African countries. You know, Currently in China, and the market is really we see very fierce competition within Chinese market. So a lot of producers are actually thinking about going to like African countries, and not to say there are some products are actually more customized to the African market, so they can if they are able to invest in African countries, they can have access to the local material to produce things that are to be sold to the local people. In that case, if we can anticipate some like a more stable conditions and more peaceful environment there, and also more stable policy measures in the African countries, we can anticipate to see more and more investors in China will relocate their production facilities in African countries.
Okay.
Hi, Mercy.
All right.
Maybe to just answer that last question as well, on the infrastructure projects. I think as many know, you know, there are definitely many benefits in terms of large-scale infrastructure projects. Mostly, I would say, the need for them. If you look at the infrastructure deficits in Africa, there's just a dire need for large-scale infrastructure. And one of the concerns is that there has been a significant waning, let's say, in investments in this area, while it is still an area that's really very much needed on the continent. So the benefits are not only for Africa's development itself, and regional developments and intra-African trade, for example, developing local supply chains, value chains, all of that, regional supply chains. I mean, the benefits are quite endless if we take infrastructure as the backbone of any developed economy, right? Reducing costs of transportation of goods and services, etc. Moving people in large-scale infrastructure also has the benefits or has the implication of also allowing freedom of movement of people, which also link to many human rights, right? So it's not just an issue or a question of economics, but it's also a question of human rights in many respects. The challenge is for this kind of investments, and I think most people in the China-Africa space have heard this many times, but the challenge is that they tend not to be particularly profitable as investment projects. They are very large scale, require coordination, oftentimes across multiple countries with various regulatory and legal frameworks. They take a long time. You have to outweigh the costs and benefits of having a project that is completed quickly versus something that takes maybe a bit more time, but that has a lot more red tape. So it's a huge area of study in itself, I think, when it comes to China-Africa relations. But just to underscore that I think it's something that is still very much needed on the continent. And so we should not lose sight of that need either.
All right, thank you so much for throwing more light on that. So I think there's one question here again from an attendee. Okay. So it's asking, is there a role for FOCAC in democratization of Africa? When it comes to democracy, is there any role that FOCAC is playing when it comes to Africa's democracy? So is there a role for FOCAC in democratization of Africa? Okay.
Nancy, before responding to this democratization thing, I'll respond a little to the infrastructure cooperation between China and African countries. Yes, because very often it's a huge investment and it takes a long time to construct. And in that case, actually, on China's side, it's pretty risky. But we believe if such infrastructure is provided to the people there, they enjoy better condition for developing themselves. And the development of African countries, in our eyes, are actually also creating a better market for ourselves. So I think in this sense, we can understand this as a win-win, but still you see the challenging Chinese companies are facing, because long time investment will very often be accompanied with a lot of risk of having like a compensation from such investment. And not to say sometimes in the Western media, it has been demonized as like making traps for African people. But based on my observation in the development of lots of infrastructure actually providing very solid foundation for sustainable development. In China, we have our own stories of like infrastructure have actually provided people in the middle and the west part a lot of opportunity of developing themselves in terms of e-commerce, for example. They can sell the goods online to the coastal areas, and also because of the improved road network or high-speed railway network, the transportation of agricultural products in the middle and the west part of a country produced by the farmers in the mountain areas can still be transported to the rich areas for sale, so that they can benefit a lot from such infrastructure development. I completely agree that yes, we both have benefits and challenges, and we need a lot we wish to see more political stability and also peace environment on all areas. Okay, and as to the in this democratization, how do you depends on how do you understand democratization? You know, in China, so we are not intended to like interfere with any countries like a domestic arrangement. But we believe in more interaction are actually mutual beneficial and also mutual influencing. So China, in certain Chinese companies are in certain sense also influenced by the business environment there. So we have to, and the business people have to adjust it to better serve the market, and also by interacting, I'm pretty sure the African people and African business are also able to learn about China's practice in improving our efficiency, in improving our to see the very close relationship between government and the people and the companies. So it depends on how you look at it. If it's only like political things, possibly it's more on the African countries themselves or African people's decision to choose to what way to democratize themselves.
Okay.
That's from me.
Dr. Stacey, would you like to add anything to that? I think it's been well
No,
explained.
I think that's been very well explained in terms of I would agree insofar as I don't think that there's a distinct role for FOCAC in terms of democratization in Africa. I think that that's very much an internal kind of affair, and internal, I mean also continental in that sense. But I think in various ways, if we are reflecting on the evolution of FOCAC itself, I think in itself there's been a process of democratization insofar as at least the inclusion of multiple stakeholders and the expansion of stakeholders that are kind of invited to take part in the forum. And that in itself is a kind of step forward insofar as inclusion and transparency, which one could take as a form of democratization to a certain degree. But again, you know, if we're speaking political systems, that's definitely not the forum to focus on political systems in terms of democratization of Africa.
Okay. I think there are still questions in the chat box, so we would like to address them. But before we come to that, there are lots of conversations still around how FOCAC has demonstrated its long-term commitment to fostering China-Africa cooperation. So can you please help us understand or demonstrate how FOCAC has demonstrated its long-term commitment to fostering China-Africa cooperation since its inception in 2000? Please, did you get that? How FOCAC has demonstrated its long-term commitment to fostering China-Africa cooperation since its inception in 2000.
I think just perhaps very quickly, I think the fact that it has stood the test of time of 24 years itself speaks to its longevity. And the fact that even after, for example, various crises or even COVID, that it wasn't, you know, that a summit wasn't skipped over, for example, or that the summit still remains something of significance for both the African continent and China, is testimony to its longevity. Maybe just also in that sense, you know, FOCAC is attended or has been attended more positively by African leaders than, for example, the UN General Assembly, which I think many people know by now, but it again demonstrates the value of FOCAC for the African continent, as well as for China in that sense. So I don't think that it's going anywhere, and I think the fact that it stood the test of time as far as it has shows that it's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, sure. Professor Zhu, do you have anything to say about that also? How FOCAC has demonstrated its commitment when it comes to Africa-China relation?
Oh, okay. I'd like to respond to this. FOCAC can influence African countries to transition from Washington consensus. So in that case, I think in Chinese discourse, we are not proposing to kind of a kind of model competing with some like a Washington consensus or anything. So this, in our understanding, is to strengthen our cooperation with African countries, and that is not targeted at like competing the other way of handling international relationship. But in China's own experiences, like we're offering you, we see that we are able to help and now are willing to offer opportunities of more cooperation, closer relationship with China and African countries. You see now currently, the trade between China and African countries are actually complementary. And also China is on the way of relocating some of our production capacities to other countries. But I'm pretty sure people can choose between what is good for themselves based on their trade and economic relationship with China, and including cultural relationship with China, because now FOCAC is actually expanding to many other areas far away from its original, like social and economic and social area. And currently, you see China is offering a lot of capacity building, competence building training for African people. And of course, we are showing African people an alternative that may be helpful for them to gain faster development in the future. And you see also we're offering a lot of scholarships for African students who wish to see African students spending years in China, and they are able to learn how China is able to develop itself, and the relationship between, for example, government and the business. Actually, in China, we see the negotiation between business and governments leads to more like equal relationship between the government and the companies. So for example, the regional Chinese government are actually obliged to find ways of developing local economy, for creating jobs for the local people. So potential investors may enjoy a favorable condition sometimes when they are bargaining with the different regional governments. However, when there is a example or a case made, then the future investors may also take the same condition while they're talking to the local regional government in terms of investing in the place. So you see, this actually leads to a lot of interaction between the government and the enterprise, which leads them to more trust between each other. And of course, this will also lead to other places like middle and the western part, which are economically lagging a little behind. So the local government are also learning from the government in the coastal areas, because the governments in the coastal areas are more able to handle this kind of relationship with the business, you see.
Okay. I think, Kwabena, that was your question being answered on how FOCAC can influence and assist African countries to transition away from the Washington consensus theory of development by private enterprise alone and adopt a customized version of the successful Beijing model. All right, thank you so much, Professor Zhu. Dr. Stacey, do you have anything to add up to the question?
Maybe just a final point for that question to add on is, I think any model that is adopted or what have you, of course, has to be customized, and it's the same goes with whether we're speaking about forms of industrialization or modernization. Within the African context, we have to be aware of our local realities and our local needs. So as much as we may want industrialization or modernization that looks a certain way, we need to consider what the risks are associated with that, and be prepared to mitigate those risks as far as possible, so that cooperation between China and Africa remains steadfast and isn't jeopardized. So finding a balance between that is extremely important, because of course, what we don't want to see happening is just industrialization and modernization at any cost. And that's why obviously a multi-stakeholder kind of approach is always important, and that includes public and private enterprises, also local communities, to really come up with solutions that work and consider the local environments and the local context in terms of how people live, how they want to live. What is it that they want out of their day-to-day lives at the end of the day? So I think a customized version of any version that we choose is important, where we put our local stamp on it at the end of the day, and that will at least secure the longevity of our development aspirations and goals.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Stacy. So we'll be ending our section, the first section, in a moment from now. So please, if you still have any questions, don't hesitate to send them in. Okay, so before we end, I would like to ask about the potential areas of cooperation that you think could shape the future of FOCAC and Africa-China relations at large. So looking ahead, what do you think are the key focus areas and potential areas of cooperation that you think could shape the future of FOCAC and Africa-China relations at large? Okay, so any of you could take this.
Okay. For the potential area of cooperation, I think we need to look at like the side of African countries, what the African countries need most nowadays. If we see the African countries are short of electricity, maybe in this area there is a very spacious room for cooperation. You see, China enjoys a lot of advantage in providing clean energy in terms of hydropower, wind power, and solar power. So all these areas we can anticipate some closer cooperation. But when we look at the current, like the food shortage due to the Ukraine-Russian war, so then in this area, agricultural cooperation is also worth looking into. You see, China is so good. Chinese people are so good at doing agriculture. So we and the Chinese government have tried really hard to secure our own food security. So we are, in certain sense, we are able to provide a lot of cooperation opportunities with African countries in terms of helping the people have enough food to eat, to do not suffer from starvation. So still, I think the basic areas to anticipate for future cooperation has already been made pretty clear, like nowadays, like in terms of infrastructure, clean development, green development. If in my view, I'd like to see if African people are able to develop their agriculture scientifically, they are able to have adequate to feed themselves, and they can start a very positive cycle of developing themselves. This actually is an idea I came to have from observing China's reform part, because our reform at the beginning starting from the countryside, when Chinese farmers, even farmers were not able to have enough to survive the whole year. So the agricultural reform helps the local people to have enough to eat, then sell the surplus food, so they can have some more income to develop, to buy things, and then that triggers a very positive cycle of development, you see.
Okay, Professor Zhu, think, all right. Dr. Stacy, do you have anything to say about that? The future trends that you think when Africa? Okay, sure.
I think I very much agree with Dr. Zhu in terms of kind of focusing on the existing areas. I don't think that there are obviously, there will always be new areas for exploration, but I think FOCAC is also at a critical time now where it needs to consolidate that which is already in place and the areas that we've already focused on to improve these areas and to make them as watertight as possible. And those include the areas of green energy, of agriculture, still infrastructure, and to make sure that we're doing these as efficiently and effectively as possible, because I still think that there's a lot of work to be done in those areas. So consolidating existing areas, I think, is the way forward. And those should remain our key focus areas in order to start and complete this kind of positive cycle that Dr. Zhu was speaking about in terms of development.
All right, thank you so much. So we would like to end the webinar, but before we end, I would like us to take this last question from Milo. He's asking if Africa is really in partnership with China, or Africa is just a growing market for Chinese goods and services. Thus, it's fragmented and weak Africa in a position to negotiate with China as equals?
I think we already took that one, Mercy, at the very beginning. I
Yes.
think it was one of the first questions that we took.
Okay. So please, if you don't mind, can you throw more light on that?
Yeah, so maybe to reiterate again, I think it depends on what goods and services we're speaking about. Goods and services, that's a big basket of things, and can include things from goods and services along the lines of investments in infrastructure or green technologies or green energy, and that is something that is welcomed. And as previously said, I would question this idea of Africa just being a market, and that being a market has innate value in itself in terms of the market drives the demands. The demands are driven by the market, and that positions you in a relatively favorable position and not necessarily a weaker position. So this idea that Africa is just fragmented and weak is also something that I would push back on. Of course, Africa is not as unified as, let's say, China is as a single player. But I think in many instances, what we see in research is that Africa has a lot more agency and a lot more negotiating power than what we often assume. And one of the key areas that we can improve on is China literacy within policy circles, and really making sure that our policymakers are really up to date and know what's happening within the China-Africa space so as to optimize our policy and negotiating position with China.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Stacy. Okay, so we'll be ending the webinar any moment from now, but before we do that, can you please give us your final words on the topic, an overview of FOCAC and how it has evolved over the years? Can you please give us your final words? Maybe Professor Zhu, you can start that.
So let me start my remark by saying that FOCAC actually offers us a great platform to share and exchange our views concerning topics that interest both sides of Africa and China. So in that case, I wish people can have a fairer understanding of the role that China has been able to play here. And so we have to maybe from the beginning, you should realize that China and African countries enjoy a lot of similarities historically, because we on both sides we have been trying really hard to find a good environment for developing ourselves. And the difference is that China, possibly because of a historical advantage we have, because we learned from our past. So we have a, comparative speaking, we have a very solid with the solidarity we enjoy in China, and all the the trust between people and the government. So even though we see in China, we carry out a prioritized way of development. Sometimes some places enjoy priority in developing themselves than other places. However, this is because of the trust between people and the government. The places that do not enjoy the policy, favorable policies at the beginning, and can still anticipate some support from the government or from other parts of the province of the country. For example, we obviously see in China there is a kind of unbalanced development. The coastal areas enjoy much better condition for developing itself. Of course, the government also at the beginning providing and the coastal area and more opportunities for developing themselves. So that means that the coastal area enjoy first mover advantage. However, based on our like consensus within the country, and now you see China has Chinese government has coordinated this pretty well, and the east and the south coastal provinces are offering a lot of help to province in the middle and west part. So in that case, although you see some prioritization, but then fundamentally we realize that we are able to provide we are trying hard to provide a more balanced way of developing the whole country. So in that case, I wish there's more consensus between the government and the African people in developing their society. So I think this is of great importance for us to ensure the domestic stability, which will further help create a very good business environment for the future development. That's for me.
All right, Professor Zhu, thank you so much for your submissions. We would like to take Dr. Stacy's final words as well.
Yes, I think Dr. Zhu mentioned some very critical areas that I definitely agree with. And this idea of trust and trust trickling down also from a governmental level down to a people level, I think is extremely important, and that the communication and transparency remains open insofar as involving people in the vision of what China-Africa cooperation means. What we don't want to see happening is pushback from communities in areas where it is unnecessary to have conflict around certain issues. And, you know, simple communication around the government strategy, around government's visions in terms of what this cooperation means for people, and what compensations are for people is extremely important to ensure that domestic stability, not only for African governments and African people, but also for China, in terms of stimulating this positive feedback loop. I think that's extremely important. As much as FOCAC by many is seen to be a kind of elite mechanism or a governmental mechanism, it should also equally be a people's mechanism. And there should be a consensus, as Dr. Zhu said, in terms of what these relations mean and what they deliver on the ground in terms of people's day-to-day life and development on the continent. Going forward, I would also just say and reiterate the importance of research as underpinning the engagements and the areas for future engagements between Africa and China, so that we can see where the gaps are, where the problems lie, where the risks lie, not because there are inherent risks in terms of China-Africa cooperation, but rather that there are certain blind spots that can be improved. And FOCAC can be a great mechanism and a great forum to focus on those areas for improvement, so that the forum remains as steadfast and as strong as what it has been up until now, and sees improvements over time, as opposed to becoming something that is far away from the lives of people. So that's what I would leave it at. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Stacy and Professor Zhu, for such an insightful section. I think this section has been very, very insightful and productive, right from our keynote delivery from Professor David Monai to our panel section. So I'd like to thank you all for your submission. Indeed, it was a great one, and FOCAC has indeed come to stay. So we need to engage policymakers to make policies and consider the reality of FOCAC and how it's shaping Africa-China relations. And also there is a wake-up call for researchers to make research a cornerstone for creating awareness on Africa-China relations and how it is evolving over the years. So we have to know that when it comes to FOCAC, we are all involved, right from the government levels to the individual level. We all need to come together and then come to a consensus on how FOCAC is really going to bring mutual benefit for both Africa and China as well. So we would like to end the webinar here also soon. We've come to the end of today's webinar. I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all our distinguished speakers and our keynote speaker as well. And to our distinguished audience, we are grateful for your time and for participating as well. So this webinar is being uploaded, it's been recorded, and to be uploaded on our YouTube page, where you can visit anytime to access all other videos that and other webinars that we've done so far. Also, we are ending this webinar here, but we are going to have a second section. So we just have 30 minutes break. Then we come back for the second section, which is also going to be a panel discussion that will be more focused on the misconceptions when it comes to FOCAC and Africa-China relations. So please don't go far, and we'll be back shortly. So this webinar has been brought to you by the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Once again, we are open to partnership, collaboration, any form of engagement. So you can always reach out to us so that we take it from there. And you can follow our speakers as well on LinkedIn so that you can connect with them, then take the conversation from there. And do all to subscribe to our YouTube page, follow us on all social media platforms to continue the conversation and get more insight on Africa-China relations as well. So once again, I thank you all for your participation. I would like to end the webinar here. Please do all to join the second section as well that's coming our way in 30 minutes time. Once again, thank you. So it's a bye for now.
Bye, thank you.